The summer heat in London was unbearable that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace, cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous King's Guards. Among the crowd stood Karen Mitchell, a 42-year-old woman from Ohio who had saved for 3 years to bring her family on this dream vacation to England. Karen wore her favorite floral dress and carried an oversized purse that seemed to contain half her belongings. Her husband Dave stood nearby looking tired and checking his watch every few minutes. Their 2 teenagers, Emma and Jake, were already bored and complained about the heat. This was supposed to be the highlight of their trip, but nothing was going according to Karen's carefully planned schedule. "I specifically asked for the changing of the guard ceremony," Karen muttered, pulling out a crumpled printout from her purse. The website clearly said 2 o'clock and it's already 2:15. She had circled the time in red ink and highlighted the location details. Everything had to be perfect for her social media posts back home. The King's Guard standing nearest to their group remained perfectly still. His red uniform was immaculate despite the heat, and his tall black hat sat precisely on his head. His rifle was held at the perfect angle, and his eyes stared straight ahead without blinking. He had been standing in that exact position for nearly an hour, but Karen didn't know this. To her, he was just another part of the tourist attraction that wasn't performing on her schedule. "Excuse me," Karen said, stepping closer to the guard. "When exactly does the ceremony start? We have dinner reservations at 5, and I need to know if we're wasting our time here." She spoke loudly, assuming he might not understand her American accent. The guard didn't respond or even acknowledge her presence. Other tourists began to notice Karen's interaction with the guard. Some pulled out their phones, sensing something interesting might happen. A few locals shook their heads, recognizing the warning signs of a tourist who didn't understand the traditional role of the King's Guards. Karen waited exactly 30 seconds, tapping her foot impatiently. When no response came, she tried again, this time even louder. "Hello, I'm talking to you. Don't you speak English?" Her voice carried across the courtyard, causing more people to turn and watch. Dave looked embarrassed and tried to pull her away, but Karen shrugged off his hand. The guard's training was extensive and thorough. He had spent months learning to remain motionless regardless of distractions. Tourists often tried to make him laugh, move, or speak. Some would make funny faces, tell jokes, or even try to touch him. But his job was to remain a silent, steady presence representing centuries of British tradition and royal protection. Karen's frustration grew with each passing moment. She had paid good money for this vacation, and she expected everyone to be helpful and accommodating. Back home in Ohio, customer service representatives always responded when she demanded to speak with managers. Store clerks always explained policies when she asked. This silent treatment was completely unacceptable to her. "This is ridiculous," she announced to the growing crowd around them. "I'm asking a simple question about a public ceremony, and he's just ignoring me like I don't exist." She turned back to the guard, her voice rising with indignation. "I know you can hear me. This is extremely rude behavior." Emma, her 16-year-old daughter, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, maybe he's not allowed to talk while he's working," she whispered. But Karen was beyond listening to reasonable suggestions. She had worked herself into the familiar state of righteous anger that her family knew all too well. The crowd was getting larger now. Tour guides began steering their groups toward the commotion, knowing that tourists loved witnessing authentic interactions. Some visitors started recording videos, capturing Karen's increasingly aggressive demands for attention from the stoic guard. "I'm an American citizen," Karen declared, as if this fact alone should compel the guard to break his silence. "I have rights, and one of those rights is to receive basic courtesy when I ask a simple question." She stepped even closer, now standing directly in front of the guard, blocking his view and invading the space that was meant to remain clear. The guard could see Karen in his peripheral vision, but his training kept him focused straight ahead. He had encountered difficult tourists before, but this woman seemed particularly determined to force a reaction from him. His commanding officer had warned the guards about entitled visitors who viewed them as props rather than professional soldiers with an important job to do. Dave made another attempt to intervene. "Karen, honey, let's just ask someone else about the ceremony times. Maybe there's an information booth or something." But Karen had reached the point where backing down would feel like admitting defeat. She had committed to getting a response from this guard, and her stubborn nature wouldn't let her give up. 20 minutes, she announced to the crowd. I've been standing here asking a simple question for 20 minutes, and this person refuses to even acknowledge that I exist. This is the worst customer service I've ever experienced. Several tourists nodded sympathetically, while others looked uncomfortable with Karen's escalating behavior. The tension in the air was becoming palpable. Even the other guards positioned around the palace grounds could sense something unusual happening, though they maintained their own rigid positions. The crowd continued to grow, forming a circle around Karen and the guard like spectators at a sporting event. Karen took a deep breath and made her final attempt at civilized communication. Look, I understand you might have rules about talking, but I'm not asking for your life story. I just want to know when the ceremony starts so my family can plan our afternoon. That's not unreasonable, is it? Her tone had shifted from demanding to pleading, but the guard remained absolutely motionless. The moment of silence that followed would later be remembered by everyone present as the calm before the storm. Karen's face began to redden, not just from the heat but from the overwhelming frustration of being ignored. She looked around at the watching crowd, feeling humiliated and angry that her simple request had become a public spectacle. Something inside her snapped, and she made a decision that would change everything. The slap echoed across the palace courtyard like a gunshot. Karen's hand had moved so quickly that most witnesses didn't fully process what had happened until they saw the red mark appearing on the guard's cheek. The crowd gasped collectively, and for a moment the entire area fell into stunned silence. Karen herself seemed shocked by her own action. Her hand was still raised in the air, trembling slightly as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had never struck a stranger before, never lost control so completely in public. The anger that had been building inside her had exploded in that single moment of contact. The king's guard's head had turned slightly from the impact, but incredibly, he was already moving back to his original position. His training was so deeply ingrained that even after being physically assaulted, his first instinct was to return to attention. The red mark on his cheek was clearly visible, but his expression remained completely neutral. "Oh my God, Mom," Emma cried out, her teenage voice cracking with embarrassment and horror. "What did you just do?" Jake stood frozen, his mouth hanging open as he watched his mother's vacation meltdown reach its peak. Dave's face had gone completely white, and he looked like he might faint. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Some tourists started backing away, not wanting to be associated with whatever consequences might follow. Others moved closer, their phones now definitely recording what had become an international incident. A few British visitors looked genuinely offended, muttering angry comments about disrespectful Americans. Karen's mind was racing as she tried to justify her actions.
"He deserved it," she said loudly, though her voice wavered with uncertainty.
I asked him a simple question 20 times and he completely ignored me like I was invisible. That's not professional behavior, but even as she spoke, she could see the disapproval in the faces around her. The guard remained perfectly still, but something had changed in his demeanor. While his body maintained its rigid posture, there was a new alertness in his eyes. His fellow guards at other positions around the palace had noticed the disturbance, and subtle signals were being passed between them. Security protocols were quietly being activated. A middle-aged British woman in the crowd stepped forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "You absolutely cannot strike a king's guard. These men are serving soldiers, not tourist attractions for your entertainment." Her accent was posh and authoritative, making Karen feel even more out of place and defensive. "I'm not entertaining myself," Karen shot back. "I'm trying to get basic information about a public ceremony, and this person has been deliberately rude to me for half an hour." She gestured wildly at the guard, who continued to stare straight ahead as if nothing had happened. More voices from the crowd began joining in, creating a chorus of disapproval directed at Karen. "They're not allowed to speak while on duty," called out an elderly man with a walking stick. "It's called discipline and tradition, something you Americans wouldn't understand." The comment about Americans stung Karen deeply. She had always been proud of her country and hated when people made generalizations about American tourists. "Don't you dare make this about nationality," she replied hotly. "This is about basic human decency and customer service." Dave finally found his voice and tried to grab Karen's arm. "We need to leave right now," he whispered urgently. This is getting completely out of hand and you just assaulted a soldier. But Karen pulled away from him, still convinced that she was the victim in this situation. Assaulted? She repeated incredulously. I gave him a little slap to get his attention. If he had just answered my question like a normal person, none of this would have happened. Her logic seemed perfectly reasonable to her, but the crowd was clearly not buying her explanation. A tour guide with a large group of German tourists approached the scene, speaking rapidly into his radio. Other staff members around the palace grounds were also making urgent phone calls. The situation was escalating beyond a simple tourist complaint into something that would require official intervention. The king's guard could hear everything happening around him, but his training kept him focused on his duties. However, he was also a human being with feelings, and being struck by an angry tourist had definitely affected him. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the humiliation of being assaulted while representing the crown. Emma was now crying quietly, mortified by her mother's behavior and the attention it was drawing. Everyone's staring at us, she whispered to her father. This is going to be all over the internet by tonight. Indeed, dozens of phones were capturing every moment of the continuing drama. Jake, trying to distance himself from the situation, had moved several steps away and was pretending not to know his family. At 17, he was old enough to understand that his mother had crossed a serious line, and he was already worried about how this might affect his college applications if the video went viral. Karen looked around at the hostile faces surrounding her and felt trapped. She had expected support, maybe even applause for standing up to what she perceived as rude treatment. Instead, she found herself isolated and judged by strangers who clearly thought she was completely in the wrong. Fine, she announced to the crowd. If nobody here wants to help a paying tourist get simple information, then I'll take my money elsewhere. There are plenty of other attractions in London that actually care about their visitors. She turned to grab her family, ready to storm off and salvage what remained of their vacation. But as she took her first step away from the guard, she heard something that made her freeze in place. It was a sound she had been demanding to hear for the past 40 minutes, but now it filled her with dread rather than satisfaction. The king's guard had finally broken his silence, and what he had to say would change everything about Karen's London experience. "Ma'am," came the guard's clear, authoritative voice, cutting through the crowd noise like a blade. "Please remain where you are." The guard's voice carried across the courtyard with unmistakable authority. It wasn't the voice of a decorative figure or a tourist attraction. This was the voice of a trained soldier, crisp and commanding, with decades of military tradition behind every word. Karen stopped mid-step, her heart suddenly pounding as she realized she had gotten exactly what she had been demanding, but not in the way she had expected. The crowd fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Where before there had been anticipation and awkward entertainment, now there was genuine tension. Everyone could sense that the situation had shifted dramatically. The guard was no longer just standing there taking abuse. He had become an active participant in whatever was about to unfold. Karen slowly turned around to face the guard. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "You can talk," she said weakly, stating the obvious. Her voice sounded small and uncertain, a stark contrast to the loud demands she had been making just moments before. "Yes, ma'am, I can speak when circumstances require it," the guard replied, his eyes still focused straight ahead but his voice directed at her, and striking a member of the King's Guard constitutes such circumstances. His accent was distinctly British, educated, and carried the kind of authority that comes from years of military service. Dave grabbed Karen's arm more firmly this time. "We're sorry," he said quickly, trying to speak for his wife before she could make things worse. "She didn't mean any harm. We're tourists and we didn't understand the protocols." His voice was shaky, with fear as he began to comprehend the seriousness of what had just happened. But the guard wasn't addressing Dave. His attention remained focused on Karen, who was now visibly shrinking under the weight of his words and the stares of the crowd. "Ma'am, what you have done constitutes assault on a serving member of His Majesty's forces. This is not a matter that can be resolved with an apology." Karen's mind was reeling. The word assault kept echoing in her head. In her anger and frustration, she had convinced herself that slapping the guard was just a way to get his attention, like tapping someone on the shoulder. She had never considered that it might be a criminal act with serious consequences. "I didn't assault anyone," she protested weakly. but her voice lacked conviction. I just wanted him to answer a simple question about the ceremony times. He was being incredibly rude by ignoring me. Even as she spoke, Karen could hear how pathetic her justification sounded. The British woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, her face flushed with indignation. Rude? You think it's rude that he was doing his job? These guards are not information desks or entertainment for tourists. They are soldiers protecting the royal residence. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen looked around desperately for any sign of support but found none. Even her own family looked ashamed to be associated with her. Emma was still crying. Jake had moved even further away, and Dave looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The guard continued speaking, his voice maintaining its professional tone despite having been physically attacked. The King's Guards have specific duties and protocols that have been established over centuries. We do not engage in casual conversation with tourists while on duty. This is not rudeness. It is discipline and respect for the crown. Karen felt her last bit of righteous anger deflating as the guard's words sank in. She had been so focused on her own needs and expectations that she had never considered that the guard might have legitimate reasons for not responding to her. The idea that he was following orders and traditions rather than being personally rude to her was a concept she struggled to accept. Security is en route, the guard announced calmly, and Karen's blood ran cold. She hadn't noticed, but several other guards had moved closer to their position, and she could see uniformed police officers making their way through the crowd toward them. Security? Karen repeated, her voice rising with panic. But I'm just a tourist. I made a mistake. Can't we just forget this happened? She looked around frantically, hoping someone in the crowd might speak up on her behalf, but the faces staring back at her ranged from disapproving to openly hostile. Dave tried once more to intervene. Officer Sir Guard, whatever your title is, please understand that my wife has never done anything like this before. She's stressed from traveling and the heat got to her. Surely we can work something out without involving the police. His voice was pleading and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cooling afternoon air. The guard's response was measured and professional. Sir, I appreciate your concern for your wife, but the matter is now out of my hands. When a member of the public assaults a King's Guard, there are established procedures that must be followed. This is not negotiable. Emma approached her mother tentatively, her eyes red from crying. Mom, please just apologize and maybe they'll let us go, she whispered. This is so embarrassing. Everyone's recording us and it's going to be all over social media. My friends are going to see this. But Karen's personality wasn't built for backing down gracefully. Even facing potential arrest, she struggled with admitting she had been completely wrong. All of this over a little slap, she muttered. In America, this would be handled with a simple apology and everyone would move on. The elderly British man with the walking stick shook his head in disgust. In America, you also don't have centuries of royal tradition and military protocol to maintain. You can't just apply your own cultural standards to our institutions and expect everyone to accommodate you. As the police officers drew closer, Karen could see that this was really happening. She wasn't going to be able to talk her way out of the situation or demand to speak to a manager who would make everything go away. She had crossed a line that she didn't even know existed, and now she was going to face consequences that she had never imagined possible. The guard spoke once more, and his words carried a finality that made Karen's stomach drop. Ma'am, I suggest you remain calm and cooperate fully with the authorities when they arrive. Your behavior will be noted and will factor into how this matter is resolved. The police officers arrived with surprising speed, their black uniforms and serious expressions making the situation feel suddenly very real and very serious. Karen watched them approach with growing dread, finally understanding that this wasn't just going to be a scolding or a warning. These were real police officers responding to a real incident, and she was going to be treated like a real criminal. Good afternoon, the lead officer said politely to the guard, completely ignoring Karen and her family. We received a report of an assault on a King's Guard. Can you provide us with the details? His voice was professional and calm, but Karen could hear the underlying seriousness of the situation. The guard maintained his perfect posture as he responded. Yes, sir. At approximately 14:30 hours, this woman struck me across the face after I failed to respond to her repeated demands for information about ceremonial schedules. The assault was witnessed by numerous members of the public. His report was concise and factual, delivered with military precision. Karen felt her knees go weak as she heard her actions described in such stark official terms. The word assault sounded so much worse when spoken by a police officer and a soldier. What had felt like a moment of justified frustration now sounded like a serious crime. "Ma'am," the second police officer addressed Karen directly, "I need to inform you that you are being detained in connection with an assault on a serving member of His Majesty's forces. You are not under arrest at this time, but you will need to accompany us for questioning." His tone was respectful but firm, making it clear that this was not a request. Dave stepped forward desperately. "Officers, please, my wife didn't understand the protocols here. She's never been to England before and she thought the guard was just being rude. Surely you can see this is just a cultural misunderstanding." His voice was shaking as he tried to find some way to minimize the situation. The first officer looked at Dave with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "Sir, ignorance of local customs and laws is not a defense for assault. Your wife struck a soldier while he was performing his duties. This is taken very seriously regardless of her nationality or intentions." Emma was crying harder now, the reality of seeing her mother being questioned by police overwhelming her teenage sensibilities. "Are you going to arrest her?" she asked through her tears. "What's going to happen to us? We're supposed to fly home on Sunday." The police officer's expression softened slightly when addressing the distressed teenager. "That will depend on how cooperative your mother is and the specific circumstances of the case. No decisions have been made about charges at this time." But his reassurance did little to comfort Emma, who could see that their family vacation had turned into a nightmare. Jake remained several feet away, his face burning with embarrassment as other tourists continued to record the scene. He could already imagine his friend seeing videos of his mother being questioned by British police, and the thought made him want to crawl into a hole and disappear. Karen found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak than her usual confident tone. "What exactly are you going to do with me? I'm an American citizen with rights, and I haven't done anything that serious. It was just a slap, not like I punched him or anything." The second officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "Ma'am, striking any person without provocation is assault under British law. The fact that you struck a King's Guard while he was performing his duties makes it a particularly serious matter. Your nationality doesn't exempt you from our laws." The crowd around them had grown even larger, with tourists and locals alike drawn to the spectacle of an American tourist being questioned by police outside Buckingham Palace. Karen could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages, and she was certain that everyone was talking about her and judging her behavior. "I want to call the American embassy," Karen announced, grasping for any authority figure who might be sympathetic to her situation. "This is being blown completely out of proportion, and I need someone to explain my rights under international law." Her demand sounded hollow even to her own ears. The first officer nodded patiently. "You will have the opportunity to contact your embassy if charges are filed. For now, we need you to come with us for questioning. The sooner we can get your statement and understand exactly what happened, the sooner we can determine how to proceed." Dave looked around frantically, as if hoping to find someone who could help them navigate this foreign legal system. "Should we call a lawyer? Do we need to find legal representation? I don't even know how the system works here." His panic was evident, and his questions only served to underscore how unprepared they were for this situation. "Sir, your wife is not under arrest at this time," the officer repeated. "She is being detained for questioning. If charges are filed, then you will need to consider legal representation. But we're not at that point yet." His explanation was meant to be reassuring, but it only emphasized the uncertainty of their situation. The King's Guard, who had remained silent during the police interaction, spoke up once more. "Officers, I should mention that the incident was recorded by multiple witnesses with mobile phones. There should be abundant evidence available." His statement was delivered matter-of-factly, but it hit Karen like a physical blow. She had been so focused on her confrontation with the guard that she had somehow forgotten about all the phones that had been pointed in her direction. The realization that her moment of poor judgment had been captured on video and would likely be shared across social media platforms made her feel nauseous. "The videos will be helpful for our investigation," the first officer acknowledged. Ma'am, are you ready to accompany us, or do you need a moment to speak with your family? His question was courteous, but Karen could tell that her time for delay was running out. Looking at her family's frightened faces, Karen finally began to comprehend the full scope of what her actions had set in motion. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her husband and children were now caught up in an international incident that could affect their ability to travel, their reputations, and possibly even their futures. "I'm ready," she said quietly, her earlier defiance completely drained away. As she prepared to leave with the police officers, she turned back to the King's Guard one last time. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time since the incident began, her apology sounded genuine rather than strategic. The police station was nothing like the comfortable, air-conditioned environments Karen was used to back home. The building was old but well-maintained, with high ceilings and an atmosphere of serious business. As she was led through the corridors, Karen felt increasingly small and out of place. The reality of being in a foreign police station as a detained person was far more intimidating than she had ever imagined. The interview room was sparse and functional, containing only a table, 3 chairs, and a recording device. Karen sat across from Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and eyes that had seen countless interviews with people who claimed they hadn't meant any harm. The detective's manner was professional but not unkind, which somehow made Karen feel even worse about her situation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Matthews began, "I want to make sure you understand that this interview is being recorded, and that anything you say may be used as evidence. You have the right to remain silent, and you have the right to legal representation. Do you understand these rights?" Her voice was clear and measured, treating Karen with the same procedural respect given to any detained person. Karen nodded numbly, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood anything anymore. The legal terminology felt foreign and frightening, like something she would see on television crime shows rather than experience in real life. "I understand," she managed to say, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Good," the detective continued. "Now, can you tell me in your own words what happened at Buckingham Palace this afternoon?" She leaned back slightly in her chair, giving Karen space to tell her story while maintaining eye contact that made it clear she expected complete honesty. Karen took a shaky breath and began recounting the events, starting with her frustration about the ceremony timing and ending with the slap that had changed everything. As she spoke, she could hear how petty and unreasonable her complaints sounded when spoken aloud in this sterile environment. The righteous anger that had driven her actions seemed to have completely evaporated. "I know it was wrong," Karen admitted, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "I was just so frustrated, and I felt like he was deliberately ignoring me. I've never hit anyone before in my life. I don't know what came over me." She looked down at her hands, which were shaking slightly from stress and anxiety. Detective Matthews made notes as Karen spoke, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. "Mrs. Mitchell, were you aware that the King's Guards are serving soldiers with specific duties and protocols that prevent them from engaging in casual conversation with tourists?" "No," Karen replied honestly. "I thought they were just part of the tourist attraction, like the guards at Disney World who interact with visitors. I didn't realize they were real soldiers with real jobs." The admission made her feel even more foolish, but she knew that lying would only make things worse. The detective nodded, unsurprised by Karen's ignorance. "Many tourists have similar misconceptions. However, ignorance of protocol doesn't excuse assault. The guard you struck is a decorated soldier who has served his country for over 15 years. He was performing his duty when you attacked him." Each word hit Karen like a physical blow. The idea that she had struck a decorated veteran who was simply doing his job made her actions seem infinitely worse. She had pictured the guard as an arrogant young man who was being deliberately rude, not as a career soldier with years of service and sacrifice behind him. "What's going to happen to me?" Karen asked, her voice barely audible. "Are you going to charge me with a crime? Will I go to jail?" The questions she had been avoiding asking finally spilled out, along with tears that she had been holding back since leaving the palace. Detective Matthews reached for a box of tissues and placed them within Karen's reach. "That decision hasn't been made yet, Mrs. Mitchell. Several factors will be considered, including your cooperation during this investigation, your previous criminal history, and the specific circumstances of the incident. The guard will also have input into how the case proceeds." The mention of the guard having a say in her fate gave Karen a small spark of hope. Her apology at the end had seemed to soften his expression slightly, though it was hard to tell with someone trained to maintain such rigid composure. Could I speak to him? Could I apologize properly and maybe explain that I didn't understand? She asked desperately. That's not how these proceedings work, the detective explained patiently. This is a criminal matter now, not a personal dispute that can be resolved through direct communication between the parties involved. The guard has filed a formal complaint and the process must follow established legal procedures. Karen felt her hope deflating as the detective explained the impersonal nature of the legal system. She had spent her adult life believing that most problems could be solved through direct communication and determination, but this situation was completely beyond her control or influence. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Dave was frantically trying to figure out what to do next. He had called their travel insurance company, contacted the American embassy, and even tried to reach their lawyer back in Ohio. Everyone he spoke to gave him the same advice. Wait and see what charges, if any, were filed, and then find local legal representation if necessary. Emma and Jake sat in their hotel room, both glued to their phones as they watched videos of their mother's confrontation spreading across social media platforms. The footage was surprisingly clear, showing Karen's increasingly aggressive behavior and culminating in the moment she struck the guard. The comments below the videos were overwhelmingly critical of Karen's actions. "This is so embarrassing," Emma moaned, scrolling through her Instagram feed where several friends had already tagged her in posts about the incident. "Everyone at school is going to see this. Mom's going to be famous for all the wrong reasons." Her teenage world, where social media presence was everything, had been shattered by her mother's moment of poor judgment. Jake was dealing with his own social media nightmare, as his gaming friends had found the videos and were mercilessly teasing him about his Karen mom, who had attacked a British soldier. The irony that his mother had become the exact type of person that internet culture mocked wasn't lost on him, and he felt a mixture of anger and profound embarrassment. Back in the interview room, Detective Matthews was wrapping up her questioning. "Mrs. Mitchell, is there anything else you think I should know about this incident? Any mitigating circumstances or additional information that might be relevant?" She gave Karen one final opportunity to present her case in the best possible light. Karen thought carefully before responding. "I just want you to know that this isn't who I am. I'm not a violent person and I would never normally hurt anyone. I was stressed and hot and frustrated and I made a terrible decision. I'm genuinely sorry for what I did, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right." Her words were heartfelt, but she knew they couldn't undo the damage that had been done. 3 hours after being taken to the police station, Karen was finally released to return to her family. Detective Matthews had informed her that the case would be reviewed by the Crown Prosecution Service, who would decide whether to file formal charges. Until then, she was free to remain in London but was strongly advised not to leave the country until the matter was resolved. The taxi ride back to their hotel was silent and tense. Dave stared out the window. Jake had his headphones on and was deliberately ignoring everyone, and Emma sat as far away from her mother as possible in the small vehicle. Karen felt like a stranger in her own family, isolated by the consequences of her actions and the disappointment radiating from her loved ones. Their hotel room, which had seemed cramped but cozy when they checked in 3 days earlier, now felt like a prison cell. The cheerful London tourism brochures scattered on the desk mocked their ruined vacation, and the remainder of their carefully planned itinerary seemed pointless now. Everything they had saved and planned for had been destroyed by Karen's 5-second loss of control. "The embassy says we need to wait for official word before making any decisions about our return flight," Dave reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "They've given us the name of a solicitor who specializes in cases involving American tourists, but his fees are—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence about their rapidly mounting expenses. Emma looked up from her phone with red, swollen eyes. "Mom, do you know that there are already news articles about this? Like actual news websites are writing stories about the entitled American tourist who attacked a king's guard. They're calling you the Palace Karen." Her voice was thick with tears and humiliation. Karen felt her stomach drop as the reality of her public humiliation began to sink in. She had thought the worst consequence would be legal trouble, But the idea that her moment of poor judgment had become international news was almost unbearable. "Let me see," she said weakly, reaching for Emma's phone. The headlines were brutal. American tourist assaults royal guard over ceremony schedule.
Video entitled Visitor Slaps King's Guard at
Buckingham Palace, and Palace Karen, when tourist entitlement goes too far. The articles included not only the video of the incident, but also screenshots of Karen's social media profiles, turning her into an instant symbol of ugly American tourism. "This is a nightmare," Karen whispered, scrolling through comment after comment condemning her behavior. The international nature of the story meant that people from around the world were weighing in on her actions, and the verdict was overwhelmingly negative. She was being held up as an example of everything wrong with entitled, demanding tourists. Jake finally pulled off his headphones and looked at his mother with a mixture of anger and disappointment that cut deeper than any legal consequence could. "Do you understand what you've done to us?" he asked, his 17-year-old voice cracking with emotion. "This isn't just about you anymore, Mom. My name is attached to this story. Emma's name is attached to this. Dad's business could be affected. You've made our whole family into a joke." The words hit Karen like physical blows because she knew they were absolutely true. In her self-righteous anger, she had never considered how her actions might affect anyone beyond herself and the guard she was confronting. Now she could see the ripple effects spreading out in every direction, damaging people she loved and cared about. Dave slumped into one of the hotel room chairs, looking older than his 45 years. "I've been getting calls from people back home who saw the news coverage," he said quietly. "Your sister called. My boss called. Even our neighbors are asking what's going on. This story has reached Ohio faster than we're going to be able to fly back there." The full scope of her public humiliation was becoming clear to Karen. This wasn't just a legal matter that would be resolved quietly. She had become an international symbol of bad behavior, and that reputation would follow her long after any criminal charges were resolved. The internet had an eternal memory, and her worst moment was now preserved forever for anyone to find and judge. "I need to make this right somehow," Karen said, though she had no idea how that might be possible. "Maybe I could do an interview and explain what really happened. Maybe I could donate money to a military charity or volunteer somewhere. There has to be something I can do to fix this." Emma looked at her mother with exhaustion that seemed far beyond her 16 years. "Mom, you can't fix this with a PR campaign. You hit a soldier while he was doing his job and everyone saw it. There's no explanation that's going to make that okay." Her blunt assessment was delivered without malice, but it was devastating in its honesty. As the evening wore on, the family tried to process their new reality. Their dream vacation had become a legal and public relations nightmare. Their savings were being depleted by unexpected legal fees and extended hotel stays. Their reputations had been damaged, possibly permanently, and at the center of it all was Karen's growing understanding of how completely she had misjudged the situation at the palace. "I thought he was just being rude to me personally," she said aloud, though she was really talking to herself. "I thought he was some kind of customer service representative who was refusing to help me. I never imagined he was a real soldier with orders and traditions and a duty that was more important than answering tourist questions." The silence that followed her admission was heavy with implications. Her family knew that this realization had come too late to prevent the damage, but they could see that Karen was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. It wasn't just that she had lost her temper. She had fundamentally misunderstood the situation and the person she was dealing with. Dave's phone rang, interrupting their gloomy contemplation. He answered it hesitantly, fearing more bad news or media attention. But after a few minutes of conversation, his expression changed from worry to surprise. "That was the solicitor," he said after hanging up. "He's reviewed the preliminary reports from the police, and he thinks there might be some options for resolving this without formal charges." For the first time since the incident, Karen felt a small spark of hope. "What kind of options?" she asked, afraid to get too excited but desperate for any good news. The idea that there might be a path forward that didn't involve criminal charges or a trial felt like a miracle. "He wants to meet with us tomorrow morning to discuss possibilities," Dave explained. "Apparently, the guard has some discretion in how he wants to proceed, and there are precedents for resolving these matters through alternative means. But," he added seriously, It would require you to take full responsibility for your actions and participate in some kind of restorative justice process. Karen nodded eagerly, willing to do almost anything to avoid formal charges and further public humiliation. But even as hope began to replace despair, she knew that the consequences of her actions would follow her for years to come. The internet never forgot, and neither would the people who had witnessed her transformation from frustrated tourist to international symbol of entitled behavior. The solicitor's office was located in a centuries-old building near the Thames, its traditional wooden furnishings and legal books creating an atmosphere of serious purpose. James Whitmore, a distinguished man in his 60s with decades of experience handling international legal matters, reviewed Karen's case with the thorough attention it deserved. "Mrs. Mitchell," he began, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the police reports, "I've spoken with the Crown Prosecution Service and the Palace Guard Command. There is indeed a path forward that doesn't involve formal criminal charges, but it requires several conditions to be met." His tone was professional but not unkind, offering hope while making clear that this wasn't going to be easy. Karen leaned forward eagerly, desperate to hear any alternative to criminal prosecution. "What do I need to do? I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Her voice was earnest, and for the first time since the incident, she seemed genuinely focused on making amends rather than avoiding consequences. The solicitor opened a folder and pulled out several documents. "The guard you struck is named Sergeant Major William Harrison. He served in the British Army for 18 years, including 3 tours in Afghanistan. He's agreed to participate in a restorative justice conference, where you would meet face-to-face to discuss the incident and its impact." The idea of facing the guard directly terrified Karen, but she knew it was better than the alternative. "What exactly happens in a restorative justice conference?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky. She had never heard of such a process and had no idea what to expect. "It's a facilitated dialogue between the offender and the victim," Mr. Whitmore explained. "You would have the opportunity to explain your actions and offer a genuine apology, while Sergeant Major Harrison could express how the incident affected him. The goal is understanding, accountability, and healing rather than punishment." Dave squeezed Karen's hand supportively. "That sounds much better than criminal charges. What else would be required?" He was clearly relieved that there might be a way to resolve this matter, without their family going through a lengthy court process. The solicitor continued reading from his notes. "In addition to the conference, you would need to make a substantial donation to the Army Benevolent Fund, which supports veterans and their families. The suggested amount is £5,000. You would also need to participate in a cultural sensitivity program about British traditions and military protocols." The financial requirement was significant, nearly $7,000, but Karen knew it was far less than what legal fees in a prolonged court case would cost. More importantly, it felt like a meaningful way to demonstrate her remorse. "I can do that," she said without hesitation. "When would this conference take place?" "If you agree to all the conditions, it could be arranged for tomorrow afternoon," Mr. Whitmore replied. "Sergeant Major Harrison is willing to meet with you at a neutral location with a trained mediator present. However, I must warn you that this process only works if your remorse is genuine and your apology is heartfelt. Any sense that you're just trying to avoid consequences will result in the immediate resumption of criminal proceedings." Karen nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of what was being offered. This wasn't just a legal technicality. It was an opportunity for real accountability and possibly even redemption. "I want to do this," she said firmly. "I need to look him in the eye and apologize properly for what I did." The following afternoon, Karen found herself in a small conference room at a community center, her heart pounding as she waited for Sergeant Major Harrison to arrive. The mediator, a calm woman named Dr. Patricia Mills, had explained the process and ground rules, emphasizing that this was about truth, understanding, and healing rather than blame or punishment. When Sergeant Major Harrison entered the room, Karen was struck by how different he looked in civilian clothes. Without his elaborate uniform and ceremonial hat, he appeared younger and more approachable, though his military bearing was still evident in his posture and demeanor. The red mark from her slap was still faintly visible on his cheek, serving as a stark reminder of her actions. "Sergeant Major Harrison," Dr. Mills began. "This is Mrs. Karen Mitchell. Mrs. Mitchell, would you like to begin by sharing what brought you here today?" The mediator's voice was gentle but purposeful, creating a safe space for difficult conversations. Karen took a deep breath and looked directly at the man she had struck. "Sergeant Major Harrison, I want to apologize for hitting you. What I did was completely wrong and there's no excuse for it. I was frustrated and angry, but that doesn't justify putting my hands on you. I'm deeply sorry for disrespecting you and your service." The sergeant major listened quietly, his expression neutral but attentive. When Karen finished, he nodded slightly before responding. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate your apology. What I'd like you to understand is that when you struck me, you weren't just hitting William Harrison the person. You were attacking a symbol of centuries of military tradition and sacrifice. That uniform represents every soldier who has served and died for our country." His words hit Karen with devastating clarity. She had been so focused on her own feelings and needs that she had never considered the larger meaning of her actions. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted, tears beginning to flow. "I thought you were just being rude to me personally. I didn't understand what you represented or why you couldn't respond to my questions." "That's exactly the problem," Sergeant Major Harrison continued, his voice remaining calm and measured. "Too many people see us as props in their holiday photos rather than serving soldiers with real duties and responsibilities. We're not theme park characters who exist for entertainment. We're guardians of something much larger than ourselves." Dr. Mills guided the conversation as Karen began to truly understand the impact of her actions. It wasn't just that she had hit a person. She had assaulted a symbol of national service and sacrifice. The gravity of this realization was overwhelming, but it was also educational in a way that criminal charges alone could never have been. "I want to do more than just apologize," Karen said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to make sure other tourists understand what I failed to understand. Maybe I could speak to tour groups or write about my experience to help people avoid making the same mistake." Sergeant Major Harrison's expression softened slightly at her suggestion. "That would be meaningful. Mrs. Mitchell, education prevents repetition better than punishment ever could." His willingness to consider her offer of additional service felt like a small grace that Karen knew she didn't deserve but was grateful to receive. 3 weeks later, as Karen's family finally boarded their delayed flight home to Ohio, she carried with her a changed perspective that would last far longer than any legal sentence. The viral videos of her worst moment would follow her forever, but so would the lessons she had learned about respect, service, and the importance of understanding before judging. She had lost her temper for 5 seconds, but she had gained a lifetime of wisdom about humility, consequences, and the ripple effects of our actions on others. Sometimes the most valuable education comes from our worst mistakes, and Karen Mitchell had received a masterclass in both the power and the responsibility that comes with being human.